Welcome to Reimagining Soviet Georgia. Today, we are very happy to welcome Professor Josef Mahoney. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please introduce yourself. Who are you and what do you research and where are you?
Okay. Well, hello, Brian and so forth. It's so nice to meet you. Thanks for having me. I'm in Shanghai. It's a very cold day today. I've been in Shanghai for about the last 16 years. I was bought out and blacklisted for my last academic job in the United States in 2009. 2010, I went to work for the top think tank of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China, but preferred to stay ultimately within an academic setting, and so transitioned to an academic job later that year here in Shanghai, although I've sustained my relationship with Beijing. I'm probably most well known for my research on Chinese Marxism. I teach the Marxism seminars, several of the Marxism seminars, to undergraduate and graduate students at my academic institution here at East China Normal University, which is about 10-minute walk that way. But I also do a lot of analysis of contemporary affairs. I write policy briefs for the Chinese government, for the Shanghai government, on a broad range of topics. And I do a lot of media. For example, last year I did 220 interviews with media outlets all over the world, but primarily in Beijing, talking about a broad range of topics. But generally current affairs. And of course, I tend to do more such shows when there's trouble between the United States and China, which, there's been a lot of that recently. I won one of the national journalism awards, first prize last year for a series that I wrote, a documentary series talking about local governance reforms in Beijing. So these are some of the areas that I work in and that I'm well known for. I'm also known as a single parent, 2 kids, one in university here in Shanghai and the other getting ready to go to university.
How did Marxism emerge in China, and how would you frame the role that the Russian Revolution and Bolshevism played in the establishment and the emergence of Marxism in China?
Well, in fact, some of the earliest transmissions of Marxism appear to have reached China via Japan, perhaps as early as 1905. although this is not entirely clear. And of course, it's coming in piecemeal initially. And we can see this in part through some of the original translations of the key Marxist expressions, which were clearly influenced by Japanese kanji, which is, these are the logographic characters that the Japanese borrowed from Chinese. And then these terms that were assigned these characters or values by the Japanese scholars entered the Chinese lexicon with those characters. And some of these would later have to be corrected because many of the Japanese translations use words that were too closely associated with Buddhism, and this sort of mysticism was considered at odds with a more materialist understanding of Marxism. Now, it's also the case that Chen Wangdao published the first Chinese translation of the Communist Manifesto in 1920. He had studied in Japan from 1915 to 1919, and he used Japanese and English translations of the manifesto as his source material. Already by 1918, Mao Zedong was working in the library at Peking University, and this would be where he would be introduced to Marxism, and then, of course, from there, participate in the May 4th movement, and then become deeply engrossed in the Marxist study group led at that library by Li Dajiao in the wake of those developments. Now, the Russian Revolution certainly validated Marxism as a possible solution to the crisis of Chinese modernity. And it's absolutely the case that the formation of the Internationale likewise supported the formation of the CPC in 1921. I think, however, that we can also trace what ultimately became some of the key theoretical divergences between Chinese and Soviet Marxism from those early days in the Peking University Library. And here, not to go too far down an academic road, this is something that we'll see really maturing later in 1937, but not really, I think, becoming clearly understood by the Chinese themselves until the 1950s, is that the key to understanding Marxist dialectics for the Chinese was always informed by yin-yang thought. And, for the old dialectics associated with Laozi, but not just Laozi, yin-yang thought has been sort of the key element of Chinese culture predating Laozi. We can see it already at work in the characters, the early formation of the Chinese characters during the Shang Dynasty. And there what we have is an emphasis in a dialectic on the concept of and, which in Chinese is the same word as harmony. Whereas in the West, certainly in the Aristotelian linear non-dialectical tradition, it's always an either or logic. Which, by the way, is deeply rooted in the Indo-European linguistic tradition, which is why we also see the law of non-contradiction prefigured in the Hindu Vedas, and then separately Aristotle expressing the same through his own meditations in Greek. Nevertheless, this is the overwhelming tradition against which Hegel and Marx would struggle as they began to craft their understanding of the dialectic. But I have argued in various publications that even though there was this desire to create the understanding, and I know this is a reductive heuristic device of the thesis versus the antithesis, we can see more so in Engels, because Marx didn't write the book of methods that he promised to write after he finished Capital, but we can see it more at work in Engels' dialectics of nature, and certainly we can see that playing a decisive role in Lenin's understanding and later Stalin's understanding of dialectics. It's this idea of the two sides is always framed primarily by an or position. So, for example, the struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, it's an either or, it's ultimately a conflict. Um, and so this is ultimately the fundamental difference. We can see this again later in Stalin. But the fundamental point is in the Chinese dialectic, it's this and that. And this is where we see, for example, Li Dajiao and Mao Zedong um, talking about the necessity of the peasant-worker alliance. In the classical Marxism or even in Soviet Marxism, there would be a fundamental conflict between the peasants and the workers. But in Chinese Marxism, it was an and. It was an and in part because that's the epistemological or philosophical tradition. It's an and in part because Mao Zedong and Li Dajiao are both peasants, but it's also an and because politically, the only way you could really mobilize the masses and bring them into the national solution was to involve the peasants because they were 90% of the population. So there's this cultural affinity as well as this political reality, as well as the identity of these people who are really moving forward that are emphasizing this aspect of and. And by the way, this goes on to become sort of the central concept all the way up to this day. But we see it being really expressed in 37 in the key Mao text on contradiction and on practice. You know, at the end of the day, I think we all realize that China was certainly indebted to the USSR, certainly used the Marx Engels collected work, which came out of Progress Publishers in Moscow as source material for a long time for its references to Marxist texts. And I think more importantly, from the Chinese perspective, I think it was always the case that the Chinese Marxists felt like they had the opportunity to learn from the Soviet experience, learn what had worked, but also what had not worked, and indeed what they needed to adjust to fit their own local conditions.
Obviously, the Russian Revolution was a revolution. So it had a revolutionary process. And then after 1917, there's a civil war. And then, of course, there's the establishment and consolidation of Soviet power. And of course, throughout the whole Soviet experience, you could argue that there's different stages and different types and different approaches to the consolidation of Soviet power. But for the sake of our discussion, I'm interested in how did the Marxists and then the Communist Party of China in its revolutionary and civil war phase um, understand, interpret, and embrace Soviet power as a state? Because what I'm interested in understanding is that, you know, there's a difference between, say, Marxism as a guiding theoretical orientation in a revolutionary struggle, and then, of course, when you're trying to build, consolidate, and construct a state. So, how did these like early years of Soviet power influence Chinese Marxism in the period before the 1949 Chinese Revolution? So, how did the 20s and 30s and this like state building process influence, affect, and maybe you could say shape Chinese Marxism?
Well, you know, I think the first point is of course that Leninism. I think understood. You know, and the term Leninism is something that people struggle with sometimes. Some people say it's a concept that was created by Stalin to give a convenient term to his own ideas. That's certainly not the way we understand Leninism in China. Certainly not the way we understand Marxism-Leninism. But above all, when we talk about Leninism in China, we don't generally equate it with Bolshevism, but more with the idea of the Leninist party system, and above all, Leninist party discipline. And this, of course, remains fundamental to the CPC, not only in terms of how it comports itself, but the way in which it exercises power in China. Now, The other thing that a lot of people don't realize is that the Leninist party system was also transformational for the Kuomintang, the KMT. And this was something that came about in the wake of the failures associated with the Treaty of Versailles, which had given Shandong, which had previously been a concession to Germany, that China had supported the Allies during the First World War with the stipulation that Shandong would return to Chinese control, but instead it was given to Japan, and this is what sparks the May 4th movement and sparks the crisis in the Kuomintang, which will lead them to reorganize as a Leninist party with support from the Soviet Union on the condition that they make the CPC a junior partner in government. Now, what's interesting here is that this is when we begin to see the KMT embracing a lot of the practices associated with party leadership in the Soviet Union, including some that some people think are a bit unhealthy. For example, cult building, which some people rightly or wrongly associate with Stalin. But interestingly, this was first embraced in China by the Kuomintang. I'm sure all of you are aware that there's a picture of Mao Zedong in Tiananmen Square, a very large picture. And what's interesting is the picture that was hanging there before Mao's picture was put up, and that was a picture of Chiang Kai-shek, or who we call in Chinese Jiang Jieshi, who was the generalissimo of the Kuomintang. Now, the point here is that the political norms that were being established in the USSR in the 1920s were in fact becoming the norms to a large extent of the two significant political parties in China at that same time. And by the way, the Kuomintang would not really drop this Leninist stance in large measure until the 1990s. Of course, they retreated to Taiwan after they lost the Civil War in 1949 and would only advance political reforms in the 1990s. Second, despite some divergences, we know that the USSR continued to support the CPC from its inception in 1921 to 1949, when the revolution was won in both material and moral ways. We can see this, for example, with the CPC expressing great faith in the socialist cause. We can see this, for example, in the CPC's determination to resist Japanese aggression, in no small measure because the CPC believed the USSR had demonstrated that its political system was progressive, that it was on the right side of history, not just morally, but also materially. Third, I've already mentioned the epistemological issue and the differences on with regard to the role of the peasants. There was some concern, and these again are lessons that we see the CPC drawing. There was some concern as we get closer to 1949 that the Soviet experience, for whatever reason, whether it was ideological or politically inescapable, that it had become too violent, and that this had created a dangerous cycle of violence that ultimately would prove too self-limiting, and that there were sort of conscientious efforts on the part of the CPC to try to limit violence. There was, for example, it was understood that in a civil war where you're fighting, that some forms of violence absolutely have to be embraced. But when it comes to assimilating liberated areas, like establishing new forms of control, we can often find the party trying to limit the number of executions, trying to create alternative solutions for justice. And this was in part derived from Mao's observations following the peasant uprising in Hunan in the mid 1920s, when he said, even in the worst cases, they're not killing the rich peasants or some of the other rich landowners. They may be dispossessing them, they may be punishing them publicly, but they're leaving them with enough land that they can continue to survive. So this was one idea of justice that existed from that earlier observation, which was instrumental in the development of Mao's own political thinking, but also from some of the lessons that they felt they were learning from the Soviet Union, which is you have to be more cautious in terms of how you wield political violence. And again, there were also concerns about self-determination and self-valuation. That one of the things that the Chinese always wanted to do was to make sure that they could save their civilization, that they could preserve their civilizational values. And in Marxism, they felt like they had found that sort of rubric, that sort of opportunity where they could bring this idea of the Chinese dialectic, that they could synthesize that, or they could what they call synthesize Marxism in a way that would preserve the fundamental Chinese values, but at the same time open the door to other forms of development. At the same time, there were concerns that the Soviet Union, that Stalin was not fully committed to a completely independent China. For example, there were some concerns that Stalin did not want, that Stalin wanted a two-state solution, that China would be divided into two parts, the North and the South, and that the nationalists would continue to rule the South. And Stalin reportedly tried to dissuade Mao from having the Red Army enter Nanjing, the Kuomintang capital. So there were some important divergences. Now, I know that you asked about prior to 1949. I think that one of the things that we would see in the late 1950s, and we can talk about this further as we reach other topics, is that we would see the CPC trying to replicate Russia's Great Leap Forward due to what they considered then to be two basic similarities that they felt they were sharing with what the Soviet Union had experienced in the 1920s and 1930s, which is going it alone in a hostile world. But there were also differences. First is that the Chinese baseline conditions were far worse than those in Russia, and as I've already mentioned, there was a desire to limit violence, to try to have a more peaceful transition. But the other thing, interestingly, and again, we can develop this more later, is that when the Soviet Union was rapidly industrializing, this was, if we historicize this moment, this was when the industrial age was still absolutely king. All right. But when China is going to try to accelerate its own industrial development, the world has changed. And this moment of change occurs in the middle of World War II, right? In other words, World War II starts off as an industrial war, but it finishes as an information war. And it's an information war in so much as it's, atomic weapons are really information bombs. The US having radar, which the Japanese didn't have, is an information weapon. The British being able to crack the Enigma machine is an information situation. So, it starts off with how many bombs you can drop, how many tanks you can create, and certainly these contributed to much of the defeat of Nazi Germany. but ultimately it ends as an information war, as the start of the information age. And the Chinese were late to figuring this out, but the Soviet Union knew this by the 1940s, and certainly the United States, the UK, and probably whatever remained of Germany. France might have known it, but wasn't able to really do anything about it yet. What we would see is China trying to replicate some of those policies that the Soviet Union had used to advance its development in that tremendous industrialization period, but then finding that these were not ultimately going to yield the sort of security and sovereignty goods that China needed, given the fact that we were already in a new age.
And how do you situate anti-imperialism in the story?
Well, first, classical Marxism and Chinese Marxism have always resolutely opposed imperialism. And we know that China has approached this both historically but contemporaneously as under the judgment that China was at one time a semi-colonial nation. From this experience, substantially, it feels like it shares much in common. It has a tremendous amount of empathy with other countries in the global South that suffered the same aggressions from others. Nevertheless, it's also the case that the CPC has variously believed that the USSR was, in some ways, also ultimately guilty of some forms of imperialism. And while this is a matter, obviously of contentious debate among Marxists around the world, these beliefs do appear to have impacted Sino-Soviet relations, especially in the 1950s. Now, at the same time, these discussions today are somewhat taboo officially in China due to the respect shown to Russia via the current strategic partnership. And those were encouraged to not talk about that history, but to emphasize other more positive aspects. However, I would suggest that concepts like Mao Zedong's three world theory, which was such a powerful expression of strategic direction in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and which I think is, in many respects, a key ontological statement with respect to the strategic direction that China has taken thereafter, that this continues to inform to this day not only the why China ultimately moved towards the U.S. In the early 1970s, but why we also have the conflict between these two countries today, that there was always sort of a strategic logic involved that would bring us to this point. Second, China, has long welcomed a broad internationalism or united front, including anti-imperialist movements that were not explicitly Marxist or even socialist. This is based on the principle that each nation should be allowed to determine its own values and development path instead of these being imposed by others. Third, there are some political discussions today about the proliferation of political parties around the world that are nominally socialist or communist, but are almost entirely focused on anti-imperialisms. And there is a concern that this risks hollowing out the socialist critiques of capitalist economy, which Marxists consider fundamental, including Chinese Marxists, who have a rather effective, albeit nuanced and not widely understood view of the role of the market or capitalism in national and human development.
The moment that the Communist Party of China actually take power in 1949, how does this immediately or over the course of the next 5, 10 years in the early stages of communist power in China, how does that affect Chinese Marxism?
Well, I think, to be clear, if we understand that Chinese Marxism has always emphasized change, and indeed the same is true for classical Marxism, then we understand that change and adaptation are not only the norm, not only desired and inescapable, but always a question of the right values, centered primarily on socialism, combined with the correct methods associated with theory and practice. And here we can talk about dialectical and historical materialism. And I think, we can certainly see a multitude of points in time in the Chinese experience where it's two steps forward, one step back, missteps, and even falls. While we can see moments of overconfidence and conversely, crises of faith, the overall trajectory, as well as the underlying values and methods, have remained the same. And this is not something that I think is widely understood or accepted, certainly internationally, and even among a number of Marxists in China, although it is consistent with the official line. Now, one of the things that you have to recall is that um, the even though you have the revolution being won ultimately in 1949, you already had significant territories already under CPC control before then. And they were already experimenting with governance, already experimenting with things like marriage reform, agricultural reform, how to organize various forces of production, how to manage relations of production, so forth and so on. So they already had many years of practical experience. Of course, this had to be broadened considerably, and there was a challenge to sort of scale up the party to meet the overall needs of the nation. Previously, you could concentrate your talent in military affairs or in the smaller areas that you control, but once you had to start moving to serve the interest of a much larger nation, much more diverse. And there's tremendous diversity geographically, linguistically, even culturally in China. So being able to scale up and meet those specific needs and conditions, and resisting sort of one size fit all policy making were some of the challenges that they had to work out as they took control of the state. But the other important thing is to remember that right out of the blocks, China is fighting. First of all, the revolution, it finishes, but the struggle with the Kuomintang never really ends. You know what I mean? There's been no final resolution in terms of the reunification of Taiwan with the mainland. Um, and For years, they would continue to fight white Chinese elements that would, do cross-border raids out of Cambodia, other places, as well as various insurgencies sponsored by foreign governments. So that was something that was going on all the way up until the late 1950s. But more directly, of course, you have the war in Korea, as well as China playing the pivotal role in defeating the French at Dien Bien Phu. It was 70,000 Chinese artillery units dressed in Vietnamese uniforms, backing up the Vietnamese troops in Dien Bien Phu that were able to defeat the French there. And then China, of course, would support and carry Vietnam to a large extent until the Sino-Soviet break reached its apotheosis in the late 60s, at which time the Vietnamese broke with China um, uh, because Chinese technology was no longer able to compete with the American technology that was coming into the field, given that 20-year gap between what was being innovated in the 1940s and then being operationalized in the 1960s in Vietnam. So, these mass tactics that China was able to use to stop the Americans in Korea, or to knock out the French in 54. These were no longer working in Vietnam in the 1960s. Vietnam was forced into a position where they had, as a condition of Soviet support, break with China, and this will of course lead to other problems in the relationship between all three countries. Nevertheless, I think that the thing that a lot of people again misunderstand about state power, but Chinese Marxism, is that the continuities that we see, say the continuity from Mao Zedong to Deng Xiaoping, is much greater than the rupture or the break. And there are important tactical shifts, and there's also the political opportunism of sort of burying old problems with the person that you're going to enshrine in Tiananmen Square, which is a very convenient political solution. But in fact, everyone realizes that the CPC today is the party that Mao built, and his ideas remain central and sacrosanct to it still.
I want to talk a little bit about the Sino-Soviet split. Obviously, I think this was an important moment, a critical juncture in the history of 20th century communism. And I think that a lot of people, when they view and they talk about the Sino-Soviet split, we sometimes tend to focus on the ideological or political split that happened, um, and the schisms that that split created in Marxist interpretations and actually the entire trajectory of Marxism, communist parties around the world. And so I have two questions. One of them is, what do you and how do you frame, how do you think about what led to and what caused the Sino-Soviet split? And then the second part of it is, how do you analyze the Sino-Soviet split in relationship to Marxism? Because there's one interpretation that kind of looks at this as a genuine ideological, political, theoretical, interpretive split in how Marxism is understood. And then I think there's another school of thought which maybe doesn't even contradict that one, but runs parallel to it, which sees the political tensions between the Soviet Union and China at the time as expressing itself ideologically, but that being kind of not a cover, but an expression of other tensions, geopolitical, material, strategic tensions. So how do you, I guess, square that circle?
Well, it is an interesting question, and I'll share with you one of the most important things I ever learned, although it took me a long time to really accept it and understand it. And indeed, really, living here for I've lived here in this run for 16 years, but had lived in China at various points for 3 to 4 years before. So it's been about 2 decades, and so sometimes it takes time to really understand something. Um, Maybe I'm just slow, but in 2010, when I was working in that leading think tank for the Central Committee, I was having lunch with a senior researcher of Marxism, and I had done my PhD in the United States. Not any place in the United States would be, sort of famously good to study Marxism. Um, I did the best I could where I was, within sort of a philosophical tradition. And we know, of course, that Marxism in the West, especially, less so in the Soviet Union, but in the West, tends to favor theory over practice. We don't have to get into that discussion, but it's a long, complicated discussion. Um, but but I would say it was fair to criticize me for believing that theory or ideology were most important in some sense. Um, maybe I wouldn't have acknowledged that, but certainly I had an unhealthy mix of the relationship between the two. But anyway, I'm having lunch with this scholar there at the think tank, and I was working as in sort of two functions, one as a Marxist expert, helping to edit the English translation of Jiang Zemin's selected works that were then being produced by that group, but also on the other side, doing research and writing papers about Marxism and Chinese Marxism, but also Western Marxism, currents in Western Marxism. So I'm having this lunch with this guy who's a very friendly guy, and and you know, I was kind of dogging him about some theoretical point, which I don't even remember what that was, and was obviously very frustrated with his answers. And then all of a sudden, he started laughing out loud, and he says, "You know, in China, we don't care as much about theory as you think we do." He says, "What we care most about is politics." He says, "You know, politics comes first, and then theory comes second." Now, he was being a little excessive, not entirely excessive, but a little excessive in the sense that theory is important. Socialism as a theory, dialectical and historical materialism, these are fundamentally important. But once you start getting into, you know, how to actually apply these things, it really has a lot. It's fundamentally guided by a position of praxis. What works? How do we create change? So forth and so on. So yes, I would say that you know, you were framing this in part as an ideological split or a political split, and I would say that on the whole, it was much more a political split. Now, I've already suggested that the CPC found the Soviet understanding of Marxism to be misguided. But it was also the case that China believed that the USSR was too willing to put its needs ahead of China's. Now, this at some point in time had been strategically understood and accepted by the Chinese. For example, during the war against fascism, the global war against fascism, China agreed to support the Soviet position that the war against the Nazis came first, and that China would have to hold the line by itself against the Japanese, which, by the way, the Chinese did. The Chinese ended up tying up the Japanese so profoundly that it not only prevented the Japanese from opening a front against the Soviet Union, it also prevented them from putting enough men and material in the Pacific to stop the American cross there. So the Chinese played a very important role in that conflict, which is even less acknowledged in the West than the profound role that the Soviet Union itself played in that conflict. But I think that there were we've already touched on some of the other issues. For example, in the mid-1920s, the Soviet position on the peasants and its willingness to work, which was of course in conflict with those who were coming from the peasants and wanted a peasant worker alliance. That was seen as sort of an ideological split, but it was an ideological split that had it was deeply connected to political concerns. And then ultimately, you know, the Soviet Union's willingness to work with the Kuomintang, which, you know, initially benefited the CPC, it didn't. In 1927 and 1928, when the Kuomintang turned against the CPC, this is after the death of Sun Chung-shan, or who we call Sun Yat-sen in English, and when the Kuomintang moved to the right, pivoted to the right under Chiang Kai-shek's direction. But there were concerns that the Soviet Union had misguided how the Chinese Marxists should respond to that crisis in 27 and 28. with some people believing that the Soviet Union could have done more to help them, but didn't. But also there were some concerns that the Soviet Union had maybe misguided them to stand up to fight it out, and this ends up decimating the party. Now, whether or not this can be fairly laid on the door of Moscow is a subject of some debate. But I'm saying there is this concern or this idea that's already percolating in the late 1920s. But then, of course, we have internal conflicts. For example, the Soviet Union ends up preferring to work with Chinese that had gone directly to study in the Soviet Union. So there were really sort of three major groups in the party. Those who had never gone abroad, and this included people like Mao Zedong, those who had gone to France and then come back or had gone onward to the Soviet Union. And this included people like Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping, and then people who had gone straight to the Soviet Union. And this included people like Wang Ming and others who we called the Chinese Bolsheviks. And the Chinese Bolsheviks were the preferred partners in the party for the Soviet Union. And they often worked hand in hand with representatives of the Internationale. And there are some reports, although it's difficult to verify, that some of these elements would try to assassinate Mao and others with whom they were facing internal conflicts. Before Zhou Enlai broke with them, Zhou's faction, being what we might nominally call the French group, broke with the Chinese Bolsheviks at the Junyi Conference in the middle of the Long March in 1934. Which, thereafter we see a party rectification and a new line being expressed, being expressed in the Yan'an revolutionary base areas. We see this, for example, with Mao writing on contradiction and on practice, which I've already discussed. But again, these were published in 1937. This is where Mao is saying, this is how we understand Marxism. This is how we understand contradiction or dialectics. And interestingly, Stalin counters in 1938. He publishes a book, Dialectical and Historical Materialism, which is a repudiation of Mao's 1937 text. And it's interesting because Mao isn't being so direct and rude as to say, oh, the Soviets don't really understand Marxism. What he's saying is, this is how we understand it, okay? But then Stalin would say, no, this is the right way to understand it a year later. But you would have Soviet scholars saying, oh, the Chinese don't really understand Marxism. They've got this primitive Taoist, yin-yang, dialectical, idealist concept, so forth and so on. So these ideological struggles are taking place. But you have to recall, it was at this same time that Mao was rectifying the party and pushing out of power these Chinese Bolsheviks that the party believed had played a role in misleading the party from 27 all the way up to when Mao took control in 34. Now, the other thing that I've said is that it's believed that Stalin preferred a two-state solution, which, according to the tradition, Mao answered with his famous poem, "The Red Army Enters Nanjing." And there have been some, suspicions that Stalin had pushed Xinjiang, that the warlord in Xinjiang was trying to come out of China and either establish Xinjiang as an independent Central Asian country or to become part of the Soviet Union. That Stalin had pushed Xinjiang back into China in order to potentially create a poison pill that might be exploited later. This is a suspicion. Again, it's difficult to sort of verify these things. Now, the next major issue comes with the Korean War. We know that the ceasefire was signed in 1953, but at the same time, there's this idea that that the Soviet Union, more than any other country, caused the Korean War, um, but ultimately it fell to China to fight it out, and that China had to do this because it was on the Chinese border, and this came at great cost to China. Some people estimate as many as 1 million men were lost, including Mao's son, who fell there. Um, but above all, we should also recall that the war in Korea distracted China from its primary objective, which was advancing against Taiwan. Now, it was the case that the United States also frustrated that as China was mounting its invasion force, the U.S. Navy rolled in to protect, and then China reoriented that force into the Korean Peninsula. But nevertheless, there was some resentment that the Soviet Union did not provide enough equipment, did not provide air support, did not provide walkie-talkies and other forms of communication that ended up costing the Chinese a lot of people. Now, I think we could discuss the extent to which the Chinese felt like the Soviet Union was kind of leaving China out there on its own with regard to China, taking responsibility for the conflict in Vietnam. But really, the key turning point is in 1956. That's when we have the Chinese response to Khrushchev's secret speech. And it's here that, of course, we see Mao's judgment, his initial judgment, his initial critical judgment on the Russian Revolution or the Soviet Revolution. He said ultimately the USSR will fail, and it will fail because it has abandoned the two swords of Marxism. He says that Stalin abandoned the sword of Lenin, and now Khrushchev has abandoned the sword of Stalin. And in so many words, this is why they're going to stagnate and ultimately fall in upon themselves. They won't be able to continue to make the necessary changes that will allow them to advance. Of course, the Chinese felt betrayed by de-Stalinization because they were still trying to consolidate their revolution. In '56, they had been forced to brand their revolution in no small measure with Stalin's image. And now that the Soviet Union was essentially saying that Stalin was evil, it was creating all sorts of political problems and undermining the political legitimacy of the party within China. The other issue, though, the deeper issue, is that there was also growing suspicion in 1956 that the Soviet Union had misled China on the first 5-year plan, that the plan was structured in a way to make China dependent on Soviet investment and technology. Ultimately, the Chinese were concerned in a way that would leave China essentially as a colony of the Soviet Union. And this is what, in fact, is going to really drive forward the Chinese response, which will be the Great Leap. The Great Leap is going to be an attempt to correct what they believe are the mistakes that they made given bad guidance from the Soviet Union. In other words, we have to continue doing some of the things that we have underway because we got too much invested politically as well as financially in some of these developments. But at the same time, we have to advance the things that we should have been doing in the first 5 years, including comprehensive agricultural reform. Otherwise, we're going to lose. And again, you should recall that in the Chinese case, because you asked earlier about anti-imperialism, it was always one of the key legitimizing factors of the CPC has always been about reestablishing Chinese sovereignty over China, right? And so if your solution to the crisis of Chinese sovereignty was that you, in effect, made China uh, a colony of another nation, then everything is lost, right? And so this was whether or not the Chinese were being too sensitive, whether or not they misunderstood what was happening. In fact, this is ultimately what they believed. The secret speech didn't help that, but the bigger issue was suspicions related to the first 5-year plan. Now, you know, with with um, with the Great Leap, they did hope to emulate the Soviet Great Leap. You know, Stalin in 1934 famously stated that the Soviet Union was 100 years behind other advanced countries, that the gap had to be closed in 10 years, or they were going to be destroyed by the enemy. And they were able to construct these successful 5-year plans that did ultimately see the USSR being transformed into the greatest steel and industrial producer in the world. And China felt like it had to do something similar, but at the same time completely reform agriculture in order to do that. And reform agriculture completely through the Great Leap, because again, you had 90% of your economy there. You still didn't have food security, and you didn't believe you had a reliable ally. So you needed to get food security. You needed to not only have food security, but realize surpluses from this tremendous section, this overwhelming portion of your economy. And so the only way you could do this was to advance with effectively, we call it collectivizations, but it's really bringing the industrial model to agriculture to sort of realize the sort of gains that would be necessary. And of course, it's in the midst of this where there are great challenges encountered. So, in the worst days of the Great Leap, you had in 1959, you had the CIA exploiting that circumstance to spark the Tibetan uprising, legacy of which remains today. But unfortunately, after the Dalai Lama escaped to India, after India, the first country to welcome him to visit was the Soviet Union. And this was seen as a profound betrayal. And just so everyone understands why Tibet is so important to China, as opposed to, say, Mongolia, right? The CPC let Mongolia go. If you go look at the Chinese maps in Taiwan kept by the Kuomintang, they still include Mongolia as part of China. China let Mongolia go, not because all territory is sacrosanct, but because some territory is integral to national security. And in this case, Tibet is some of the most important territory in China because it's not only the high ground. For example, you can think of the Golan Heights, the importance of the Golan Heights to Israel. Whoever occupies the high ground has a certain strategic advantage. But it's also the case where all the headwaters of China's major rivers are. So whoever controls the Tibetan Plateau controls Chinese agriculture. And this is why in earlier generations, back in the age of Imperial Russia and the UK, they played the 100-year game trying to gain control. There were two areas they wanted control over, Afghanistan and Tibet. If you controlled Afghanistan, you control Central Asia. If you control Tibet, you can control China. And so this understanding of the strategic importance of China was nothing new. It goes back centuries. So it's always been non-negotiable. So the fact that the Soviet Union um, was willing to break bread with the Dalai Lama was seen as a profound betrayal, and certainly we can say that the conflict is or the break is absolute in '59, although it won't be so absolutely clear to people around the world until the early '60s when we start to see a large number of polemics being produced in Beijing targeting the Soviet Union. Now, I think the other thing that happens is that just to sort of put a capstone on a point here, one of the things that a lot of people don't understand about the Great Leap, um, and I confess that my position here is not widely held and certainly controversial, but what we what most people don't understand about the Great Leap in China is that while there were certainly tremendous failures with certain specific policies, and while we saw complete breakdowns in some jurisdictions, for example, Anhui province faced probably the worst damage, due in part to some issues with the climate, um, some extreme weather, but there might have been other concerns with the local leadership there. The fact of the matter is, China did manage to radically restructure its entire 90% of its economy in 3 or 4 years, and then with just modest reforms in 60 and 61, this system of collective agriculture not only gave China food security, but provided the surpluses needed for China to build out its infrastructure and would not be reformed again until the mid 1980s when China was in a better position to advance new reforms. So this is, this is something that I think is important to be understood. Nevertheless, again, by the early '60s, hostility between the two countries continuing to deteriorate. Vietnam comes into play in '67 and '68. The CR, the Cultural Revolution, comes into play. And then, of course, by the late '60s, we see China and the Soviet Union fighting a border war.
In 1956 was also the Georgian Soviet split too, because of the secret speech, but pretty much all of Georgians were implicated. So very much put Georgia at odds with central
Though,
leadership.
one of the things, I'm sure you've heard this, but although Stalin is from Georgia, it's said that one of Stalin's strengths was that he was more Russian than Lenin.
Yeah, I don't really buy that at all, actually. I think he was incredibly Georgian. I think he had a lot of experiences in Georgia, his fundamental experience of becoming a revolutionary. But I think he saw the limitations of what could happen to a small nationality that's kind of isolated. And I do believe that he was someone that thought that a larger sort of formation, right, would benefit smaller nationalities. So actually look at it a little
Yeah,
differently.
I'm not going to dispute his Georgianness. What I said was that he was considered more Russian than Lenin because he had spent so much time moving around Russia and in Russian prisons in different parts of Russia that he had a better understanding of real Russian conditions than Lenin did.
Yeah, absolutely, because he was a practical organizer, and he was sort of an intermediary between the intellectuals and the workers. So he did have to do a lot of the actual on the ground work. But that's actually where Lenin's theories of national self-determination and which are important, of course, but because Stalin had those experiences, especially in Georgia, where he was ousted by the Social Democrats, and seeing, I think, like how if, when you relegate things to a much more smaller space, smaller nationalities, that things can go much worse. Let's say it sort of leads to provincialism, sort of a lot of being locked in within yourself. Um, I do believe that's why he advocated for larger formations that would actually have a much more unifying and also give a chance to smaller nations to be exposed to a lot of different places, which I see it today, with our independence, so-called independence, right? Which is complete loss of sovereignty. And we're struggling terribly. Like,
So Mao had a critical position on Stalin, and it seems that Mao did not personally like Stalin that much from some of the references that we see. Um, but at the same time, I think there was a tremendous amount of respect for Stalin, and certainly a tremendous amount of respect for the fact that Stalin had played such a pivotal role in organizing the defeat of Nazi Germany, which I think the Chinese then and now they always historicize the Stalinist experience with that context. This is not to say that all things are forgiven, um, but what I think Mao's famous judgment is that the Soviets should have judged Stalin as being 70% right and 30% wrong. And Mao suggested that he might also be judged that way himself when he was gone. Um, that to completely abandon someone who played such a pivotal role in your formation and development was to essentially delegitimize yourself, and to leave yourself open to all sorts of revisionism that would ultimately come back to haunt you in various ways. And I think this understanding certainly was shared by many of Mao's colleagues, including those who didn't like him very much, and it certainly shows up even in the assessments that the CPC made of Mao Zedong after his passing. Um, saying, okay, this, he made some mistakes. These are the mistakes. It's sometimes said that the official assessment did use the 70-30 um, formulation. I don't see any official record that it was used, although it's often quoted in anecdotally. But nevertheless, this was another example of where the Chinese were learning lessons of what not to do. Yes, they were unhappy with de-Stalinization because it compromised them politically. They were also unhappy, it turns out, with what they saw as sort of a Stalinist conspiracy to sort of undermine their independence and sovereignty. Um, and at the same time, they judged the judgment of Stalin, the de-Stalinization campaign, to be self-defeating. So, interesting sort of set of issues there, but gets straight to the heart of the contradictions that the Chinese themselves were trying to balance as they moved through that period of time.
well, China is lucky in that sense because they were able to constantly observe the mistakes of the Soviet Union and not make those. And even the collapse of the Soviet Union, they were able to observe. So I do think they had a privilege in that sense, because I do find the de-Stalinization is actually what really undermined the Soviet Union. And I applaud how, even with reforms, like no one, China, Mao was not undermined, but like kept as part of, as a continuity. And I think that would have helped keep sort of a revitalization, at least in the Soviet Union, because what they did was cut off the roots of many believers and many real diehard socialists by undermining Stalin, which then led to people who stayed in power who were much less ideological, let's say, and much less committed in ways that, if that continuity existed, would have been able to, the people that would have been able to succeed in coming to power, I feel like we would have better options, let's say.
Well, I'm not enough of an expert on Soviet politics or Stalin to take a strong position. I'm certainly I certainly believe the Soviet Union handled it poorly. At the same time, I'm not completely an apologist for Stalin either. But by that same measure, I'm not a complete apologist for Mao. I think Mao was the greatest revolutionary political organizer in history, but he did make a number of mistakes that required correction. That said, in my own opinion, just because we're having this conversation, I believe that there were two things that in that period of Stalin that created long-term effects that then lead to later problems. The first is Lenin's revolution didn't work according to plan. We have an Iskra, it's going to spark a global revolution, and then everything's going to work out okay. And that didn't happen. And then you start seeing the Soviet Union having to make all sorts of exceptions and theoretical changes in order to deal with the reality that didn't conform to the theory. And this will lead to many of the changes which Stalin will make, that we associate with Stalin, including the theory of socialism in one country or state capitalism, so forth and so on. It's also the case, so that's the first issue, is that, cleaning up the shortcomings of the Russian Revolution fell to Stalin ultimately. And this was a greater burden than fostering the revolution itself, right? The second thing is, the overwhelming burden of having to face Nazi Germany. So these two different issues, I think, created these sort of exceptional moments that required exceptional politics, and this, in my opinion, created a cycle that ultimately was hard to break out of. And even in the aftermath of World War II. I do think that part of what Khrushchev and some of these other guys were doing, although they were certainly acting in their own political self-interest, that there was, because as a Marxist, I don't believe that it really matters what this person or that person thinks, that ultimately people are responding to larger historical material forces. And so I think there was this need to find a dramatic correction, and I'm not sure what the right correction was, but I'm pretty sure that the correction they employed was wrong. And whether they could have found a better one, I suspect that they could have. I think maybe the Chinese did learn. I think Mao was instrumental in figuring out that lesson. But there are, to go back to some of the earlier points raised in this question, there are those in the West. I encounter, these Marxists from Europe, especially. I don't encounter any Marxists from Russia who think this way, but from Europe, so-called Euro-communists and others, who believe that China embracing the United States is actually what killed the Soviet Union, and that China, became part of the capitalist global order and perpetuated American power through that action. I think that this is a gross misunderstanding of what the Chinese were doing, and indeed the actual trajectory of the Soviet Union.
I want to address the Cultural Revolution. Maybe for our listeners, the first step would be, could you just explain what the Cultural Revolution was? And then the second part of that is, how did this affect Chinese Marxist thinking? Obviously, there were different forces inside of the Cultural Revolution, right? Different ideas, different factions. But also, I'm curious the aftermath and the effects of it on how Chinese Marxism kind of situated itself and expressed itself.
But to be clear, my views are heterodox, or I've been accused of being hetero in my understandings of history. It's probably responsible to admit that from the start. Now, you asked for a general description of what happened during the CR. I think there are sort of two descriptions that we have to give. The first is the standard description, which I don't completely agree with, and then my description. And I will say that my description is something that I developed after teaching modern Chinese politics and Chinese history for a decade, where going through the same material, the same historical development over that period of time just forced me to sort of come to terms with things that I think were being neglected by both the Chinese official narrative as well as the Western narrative. Now, in terms of the overall, let's say, Western narrative as well as the official Chinese narrative, the CR is, I'm just going to call it the CR from here on. The CR was launched in '66. In fact, it had a precursor, a forerunner in the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. The editing, the bringing together what becomes the quotations of Chairman Mao, or the Little Red Book. This was done prior to the CR, and the formations of the Mao Zedong study groups. This was started first in the army. And then this model was pushed out onto broader society in 1966. Now, conventionally, the narrative is Mao, who had stepped back from power following the problems associated with the Great Leap, wanted to reassert his position and push back what he saw as the growing liberalism in the party, which nominally was directed primarily at two people, Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping. These were the two leaders who had been tasked with advancing reforms to moderate some of the excesses associated with the Great Leap. Mao also probably felt like his position in the army had been compromised, in part because when Mao was stepping back in '59, he stepped back through a tactical adjustment of bringing down Marshal Peng Donghuai, who had been responsible for leading the criticism of Mao during the conference that year, where they were assessing the failures associated with the Great Leap. It's also the case that Deng Xiaoping, for those of you who know Deng Xiaoping, his political base is in the army. Now, Mao had three political bases in the farmers, in the urban left, and in the army. But Deng's base is also in the army. So it's clear that Mao wanted to reestablish sort of ideological preeminence over the army, in part because he felt like there were elements there, perhaps those represented by Deng, that were maybe going to lead the country in a different position. Now, again, this is sort of the semi-official narrative, and you sort of see this in Western textbooks, but also to some extent in official Chinese narratives. Now there are other narratives, and these will be more emphasized in the Western histories that that Mao indulges in a personality cult in order to um, fully realize his return to power, and he empowers um, people, initially Lin Biao, then his wife Jiang Qing, in order to advance radical elements in the cultural sphere, not only to consolidate his cult, but also to it's theorized that well, maybe the reason why China hadn't broken through with the sort of ultimate um, socialist revolution was that there was some sort of deep cultural resistance, and we needed to finally break that by breaking the intellectual classes and those who produce cultural products, where you could still see, um, by some estimates, um, bourgeois or imperial or colonial culture.
Liu Shaoqi falls, and Deng Xiaoping is sent down. And this is where the Chinese narrative kind of leaves off. In the Western narrative, Liu Shaoqi is abused and not given effective medical care and allowed to die, or indirectly killed. That's not something that the Chinese narrative touches on. Nor does the Chinese narrative talk about the fact that Deng comes back, gets sent down again, comes back, gets sent down again. And Deng Xiaoping himself neglects this in his own history of sorts, because he neglects altogether the period of 66 to 76 in his selected works, although he made a number of very important speeches during that time that were instrumental in later policies. Now, officially in the West and in China, the CR runs from 66 to 76 when Mao died. According to Mao Zedong, the CR runs from 66 to 68. In 68, he declares it finished. Now, also neglected in the official narratives is that once the CR was finished, this is when the Sino-Soviet split is really going bad. Mao commissioned what is called the General's Study, or the General's Survey, with the question, which country should China draw close to, the Soviet Union or the United States? And I don't know that the results of that report were not already prefigured by Mao Zedong, but nevertheless, the answer was the United States. So we know that as early as late 68 or as late as early 69, China begins making overtures to the United States about mending ties. Now we know that, according to Kissinger in his book on China, the United States blocked, effectively extended its nuclear umbrella to China to prevent a Soviet nuclear attack against China in 68 or 69. I doubt very seriously that the Soviet Union was ever thinking about attacking China with nuclear weapons. It might have been something that was being discussed in Moscow. There may have been people who really wanted to do it in Moscow, but I have a hard time believing that the Soviet Union would have ever resorted to that ultimately. And for a long time, I had discounted Kissinger's view. We know that Kissinger really liked to present himself as the hero of China. I did in the past year hear an interesting anecdote in Beijing, which I can't verify as a matter of historical record. Um, but the story that I heard is that Mao Zedong had, or the CPC or whoever it was, had contacted the United States and said, "Listen, if you don't provide us with some protection from the Soviet Union, we're going to launch all of our nukes against your positions in Korea and Japan. Um, and we can't hit you. We can't really defeat you in terms of your country. We can obliterate whatever presence you have in Asia." Um, and and that this was a compelling argument for the United States to um, intercede and to warn the Soviet Union against striking China. Again, I don't know that that's true. Um, it sounds like something that Mao would have done. Um, it sounds like the sort of detail that Kissinger would omit. But I also don't believe that the Soviet Union ever would have struck China with nuclear weapons. Um, okay, so to go forward with it, the the reason so this is going to be sort of my heterodox understanding of why we have the CR. If we go back to 1956, recall this is when Mao declares that the Soviet Union will fail, and again he tells us why. Um, and we also understand that by the late 1960s, given all that's transpired in Europe, that China is more firmly convinced that the Soviet is an imperial power. Soviet Union is an imperial power. And we see this showing up in the early 1970s when Mao formulates the three world theory, where he says the first world is the United States and the Soviet Union. The second world are those countries that are dominated by, in one form or another, by the two great powers. And the third world is everyone else who doesn't want to be dominated and is seeking a different path. So it's clear that this formulation is very active in their thinking. But again, the Chinese believe that they're seeing two things in the 60s. First, and this goes back to sort of the controversial interpretation I gave you, the Great Leap, which is the Great Leap was incredibly successful. In the scope of communist politics, we can never acknowledge that it was incredibly successful because we can never say that the ends justify the means. And the means were incredibly painful, but they did revolutionize 90% of the Chinese economy and did provide both surpluses and food security, which was their fundamental purpose. And they did this in 3 or 4 years. People, and I'm not diminishing the loss of life, and I'm not going to argue that there weren't better alternatives. These are, hypotheticals that as a Marxist, I'm not that interested in anyway. But I acknowledge that maybe more moderate policies might have been undertaken. At the same time, I have grown accustomed to not second guessing um, Chinese leaders in Beijing who have generally tended to be extremely well informed and extremely strategic and tactical in their decision making. So, and given all the misinformation that proliferates, it's I have a tendency to sort of yield to their judgment, even if I do acknowledge that on many occasions they have made mistakes. But the key here is, despite the tremendous successes associated with the Great Leap, which came with a tremendous cost, it was in the early 1960s, precisely because they are fighting the Americans in Vietnam, that the Chinese are starting to understand that we are now in the information age, and that if you're not in the forefront of information age development, then you are falling behind at an exponential rate. And so the only way that you can close this expanding technology gap is that you have to draw close to one of the great powers. Now, which country do you draw close to? Well, from the Chinese position, the Soviet Union was already starting to stagnate and was going to fail eventually. And they felt like the Soviet Union had already betrayed them in various ways. And then you're assessing this prospect that in the future, you're going to have to stand, you're going to stand alongside a country that's failing, which is dangerous. But even more dangerous than that, you may have to face the United States alone. And this is where I think Mao goes back to Sun Tzu, back to the art of war, which of course had played such a tremendous role in his thinking in guerrilla warfare, which is you figure out who your enemy is, your true enemy, and you get as close to them as possible. You learn as much as you can. You get tech transfers, capital transfers. You create a relationship so they think that you're friends. You create a relationship so that ultimately, if they try to hit you, they risk hitting themselves. And I think that is precisely what they did. And I think it's precisely during the CR that this tactical adjustment is made. And that it required the CR, because here's the interesting thing that so many people forget when they talk about the CR. It's in the middle of the CR, which so many people remember as a period of radical leftist excess, that China opens to the United States. And if you understand the way Mao thinks about dialectics, you think there's not a relationship between this radical left move on the one hand and a radical right move on the other. He's setting the table for himself, which is to say, ultimately, he's also setting the table for Deng Xiaoping. So if we go back and we look at who are the two, let's say, broadly speaking, the three major victims of the CR, the first is the party itself, right? So Mao is using this as an opportunity for broad party rectification. But secondarily, there are two people, Liu Shaoqi and Lin Biao. Now, Liu Shaoqi represents what Mao would consider to be the right wing of the party, but Lin Biao represents the left wing of the party. What do these two men have in common? They both favored drawing close to the Soviet Union. Deng does not appear to have taken a strong position. Deng survives, Deng persists, but these other two comrades will fall. And I suspect they fall because of their politics vis-a-vis the USSR versus the United States. So this is in line with sort of my analyzing the CR from a perspective of historical materialism. To run through the formulation quickly, Mao mobilizes the urban left to knock down the urban right. No, first, Mao locks up ideologically the army, then mobilizes the urban left, his ally, against the urban right, his enemy. Why? Because he's going to move to the right, and he can't afford to alienate the urban left, because even though the urban right will like what he's doing, they always hate him regardless. So mobilize the urban left, knock down the urban right, then send everybody to the countryside, and if they don't go, the military makes it happen. Now you have a free hand to do what you want. Meanwhile, you tell everyone that you're sending down that they need to learn from the countryside. And in part, this is true. The Communist Party had this tradition going back to the Long March, that people in the city, people from the even party members from the city, that they needed to know more about that 90% that was living a different life. At the same time, one of the things that a lot of people don't realize, and we're just starting to publish this research now in China, is that it's during the CR that we have the massive increase in literacy in China, because it turns out a lot of these people that were sent down to the countryside, the farmers, they're not idiots. They don't need more people standing in rice paddies. They put them to work as school teachers. And so this is when we see this incredible uptick in literacy, especially among Chinese girls. And this is something that's really going to accelerate the intellectual development of China thereafter in the 1980s and 1990s.
Now you've set the stage for Deng Xiaoping, and you can maybe tell us about what happens to Chinese Marxism, or how does it expand? How does Mao's ideas, which you're saying that Deng is also at this table that Mao had set, guide us through that?
Well, we generally sort of, I think in contemporary China, but also in Western discourses on China, most people imagine sort of Deng coming into existence politically in 1978. Deng was one of the key Red Commissars during the Civil War. And whenever foreign leaders would come to China, Mao would always introduce them to Deng in more or less the same one or two ways. They would say, he's short, but don't let his size, don't be misled by his size. He's a big man. And secondly, he's the one who will be here after the rest of us are gone, right? And Mao knew this because Deng was much younger than everyone else. He had lied about his age to go to France, but also because Deng was so tremendously capable politically. And again, as I've mentioned, his political base was in the army, and Mao understood this. He understood that that's why Deng would persist. Some people say that Deng being sent down was him being punished. Others say these were efforts to protect him in part. It may be a combination of the two. Nevertheless, what we can see, I think, is that Mao did set the table for Deng. And aside from, I think, the general tendency, again, of sort of misrepresenting the transition from Mao to Deng as a radical rupture, I think we should look at the continuities. That yes, there are some very important tactical shifts, but the continuities are even greater. And we see this, I think, above all in Deng's understanding of dialectics, which he takes directly from Mao Zedong, and the way he develops strategies, some of which are already in place, but continuing. Now, it is the case that Deng will. Well, it's difficult to say. I mean, if we understand that Mao is the genius that really lays the foundation of the party, Mao's contributions or achievements in institution building are tremendous. But in terms of building more effective bureaucratic institutions, this is something that we'll see Deng doing, that Deng will be more devoted to institutional building in the state building context. Deng will also embrace more radical policy experimentation. We'll see an increasing professionalization, the building of generations of cadres that that will run in tandem with a sort of a 10-year window. So, for those who know Mao said that we need to have a revolution every 10 years, primarily a revolution against the party itself, because the party sort of becomes entrenched in its own thinking, and it gets stuck in time, and we have to like knock those down every 10 years so that we can continue to take steps forward. So Deng tries to institutionalize this with 10-year changes in leadership, and to support that, to build like these generational classes of cadres that will be ready to step into these higher and higher level positions every decade. Nominally, we see that producing things like more or less 10 years of Jiang Zemin in power, followed by 10 years of Hu Jintao in power. But we also find that institutionalization didn't work. That ultimately the Shanghai faction of Jiang Zemin was able to entrench itself too much in power and in control over certain economic sectors, and the Hu Jintao faction, the Tuan Pai faction, was never able to really push them out of power once they came to power, and so as a result, we saw a breakdown of Leninist party discipline. We saw the party gridlocking. We saw mounting corruption and the inability to advance reforms. And this is what creates the necessity of Xi Jinping's party rectification, anti-corruption campaign, and so forth and so on, state reforms. So Deng does make these dramatic changes. To some extent, they do open the door for radical changes, but to a certain extent, they also are unable to fulfill some of their more noble objectives. Now, in Chinese, excuse me, I'll back up and say that some have compared Deng's reforms to Lenin's new economic policy from 1921, and others have compared him to Stalin, not only given China's rapid development, given Deng's reforms, but also the problems associated with 1989. But I think these are really ahistorical and silly comparisons. More reliably, I think we can say that in Chinese Marxism, we now have three broad periods when we speak of the development of theory development. First is the Mao period, and for those who are familiar with the Chinese lexicon, we refer to Mao Zedong Sixiang, or Mao Zedong thought, Sixiang thought. Deng Xiaoping is expressed in theoretical terms as Deng Xiaoping Li Lun, Deng Xiaoping theory, right? So thought, theory, and then with Xi Jinping, we're back to thought, Xi Jinping Sixiang, or thought. Now, although Sixiang is sometimes erroneously translated in English as ideology, and as we know from a purely Marxist point of view, ideology is always false consciousness. Sixiang represents sort of a higher order of confidence in theory and practice, whereas theory, or Li Lun, represents sort of a period of exploration, of growing, learning, and development through transformation and practice, feeling the stones to cross the river, as Deng Xiaoping put it. But in the new era that we generally ascribe to, corresponding to President Xi's rise as the party center, or representing the core of the party, we say that in fact China learned the lessons, through that period associated with Deng, which includes Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, their various theoretical contributions to Deng Xiaoping theory. But now we have figured out those core lessons and are moving with a new sort of confidence, reminiscent of that initial confidence that correlated with Mao Zedong or Mao Zedong thought and Mao Zedong's period. Now, again, I think that the key with Deng is he has a fundamental alignment with Mao when it comes to an understanding of dialectical and historical materialism. At the same time, again, as a Marxist, I don't think it's really about leaders, though their genius and capacity play roles. Mao certainly led efforts to establish a new order that reached a certain level of actualization, and then it prepared a transition, which was facilitated ultimately in part by his own passing, with Deng being able to sort of bury the past and sort of lay previous mistakes, but then at Mao's door, but then move forward, but again to do so in ways that didn't resort to sort of the political excesses that we see with de-Stalinization. But again, as a Marxist, I think it's really about how do these leaders who are exceptional people, how do they respond to the underlying economic, historical, material forces over which they have to contend with domestically, but also geopolitically. And so I think that these leaders are really incarnations that we use their name to give us a nice label for ways that we deal with problems in different moments. So I'm not saying again that the leaders don't play very important roles, but in Marxism and certainly in Hegelianism, you have the concept of the cunning of reason, which is to say, it doesn't really matter what sort of stupid stuff Donald Trump does. He can't just, pretend that the world is now in his image. He can't just pretend that the U.S. is great again. And even if he does a lot of stupid things, these stupid things ultimately contribute to a sort of progressive development of, for example, his aggression against India, against China, against Russia, against everyone, then creates opportunities for other new alliances and deal making that ultimately accelerate American decline. So it doesn't really matter whether you're on the right side or wrong side of history. And this is not to, valorize determinism or embrace moral hazards. I'm simply saying that the Chinese leaders ultimately were able to discern the right path, and they deserve credit for that. But in large measure, right, that path is not predetermined, but substantially shaped by the actual material conditions under which they struggled.
We watched this documentary about the kind of Chinese view of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Chinese view on the role of history and the concept of historical nihilism, right? And so for our audience, for our listeners, could you just talk a little bit about what is this concept of historical nihilism? And maybe in conjunction with that, how do you see memory politics playing a role in China today?
Well, I looked up, just to sort of get the official position on historical nihilism. I looked this up, and I'll quote it. And this is a translation that I've done, so you wouldn't be able to find. I think this is a direct quote, but nevertheless, I am quoting, and that is, first, that historical nihilism refers to the erroneous ideological trend of distorting, denying, or disparaging history, particularly the history of a nation or a political party. In the Chinese context, it often manifests as the denial of the history of the CPC and the PRC and the socialist system. Now, the CPC and Chinese government resolutely oppose historical nihilism, insisting on a correct view of history. They emphasize the importance of historical education to guide people to correctly understand and evaluate history, to uphold the truth of history, and to inherit and promote the glorious traditions and revolutionary spirit of the party. Now, this is of great significance for consolidating the ideological foundations of socialism with Chinese characteristics and ensuring the long-term stability and security of the party and the country. Now, that's more or less a translation of an official position. In fact, the CPC has an official history. This is taught and memorized, and certainly in its most public and widespread forms, it must, it's inescapably, it must be reductive and politically sensitive, which is to say, it is inescapably selective about what is discussed and how much emphasis is placed on particular points. In fact, this reductive element in official historical narratives and propagation is true in every country in the world. And on the whole, I would say that China does, in my estimation, a much better job of discussing truth, historical truth, than the US or the United Kingdom, and certainly in ways that facilitate new histories of social and developmental progress. The second, of course, is what you've mentioned with memory politics, and this is sort of interesting because when it comes to this idea of historical nihilism, but also memory politics, there are a lot of critics who hold opposite views, and in particular, with memory politics, we've seen this as a favorite term of liberals, promoting what we might call the wild swans version of Chinese history, emphasizing the memories of maybe a few who faced tremendous hardship, and holding these as the standard experienced by the masses, or even dramatically telling stories that never really happened. Although we acknowledge that over the course of China's modern development, there have been a lot of sacrifices, and indeed many that we wish could have been avoided. Nevertheless, it's also the case that memory politics is a key concept for the CPC and the Chinese states. And here, again, we can sort of look at how the state discusses it. They say that memory politics refers to the ways in which states, societies, and political groups selectively emphasize, interpret, and commemorate historical events to shape collective memory and national identity. And in China, memory politics is an integral part of the socialist core value system, and thus aims to correctly guide the public to understand history, cherish the present, and look forward to the future. And again, that the CPC and the government attach great importance to memory politics overall. But I think, to sort of summarize this, there is this understanding that memories must be, I don't think guided is the right word, but they need to be encouraged in a certain way. This is not to say that memory should be forgotten, but as a society, as individuals, but also as a society, we need to avoid dwelling on negative experiences. And here I'll give you an interesting example. So for a long time in China, we emphasized what historians call the century of humiliation, starting from the Opium Wars in the 1840s, instigated by the British, all the way up to the defeat of the Japanese in 1945. That this was the century of humiliation. And this narrative, this narrative played a tremendous role in national consciousness and socialist uh, um, 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 education and the idea of how we all fit together in China, all the way up until the new era of Xi Jinping. And then what we began to see is this push from the party to de-emphasize the narrative of the century of humiliation. That at a certain point in time, it was important for us to understand that we had been victims, but it was increasingly important for us to acknowledge the extent to which we had been victors and not victims, especially as China needed to transition from this pre-Xi stance where you avoid direct contest with the United States, you bide your time, you build yourself up. But as you start to transition and reemerge as a major power, you need to have the confidence that you can stand toe to toe with anyone in the world. Otherwise, um, uh, people will lose faith in your rejuvenation and your need to now take the next step forward in your national development. So, what we've seen is increasingly this we no longer emphasize the century of humiliation um, or narratives related to victimization. We now focus more on how China, for example, we can point to last year, the 80th anniversary of the defeat of fascism and the tremendous effort from the CPC and the state government to educate the people on the tremendous contributions that China made to the defeat of global fascism and the Japanese, the extent to which the Americans learned their guerrilla tactics. They had American generals embedded with the PLA. These went back and started the first Green Beret, or what became the Green Beret, or the Special Forces units. Um, and that then played pivotal roles in fighting the Japanese in the Pacific. So going back and emphasizing these elements to reclaim a sense of national power. And interestingly, one of the things that we've seen, and whether or not this is a good thing, it's simply a thing that we see in popular discourse, um, is that increasingly Chinese people feel confident. And above all, we see this being expressed by Chinese men, that historically they felt comparatively weak or disempowered compared to Western men. But I was talking to actually a famous Chinese liberal from Taiwan who was saying, there's a lot I don't like about Xi Jinping, but I respect myself much more as a man now because of what he has been able to push through. So again, whether you see that as a positive or negative thing, I think as a feminist, we might go, well, maybe there's some downsides there. But nevertheless, these are um, some of the ways in which memory politics are being shaped in order to help China um, push forward its socialist development and achieve social justice for its masses.
if there's anything you want to say about maybe say modern, Marxism or current Marxism, let's say, or any like last points, you can add to it. But otherwise, I think it's such a great interview already.
I think just a few points about uh, Xi Jinping. We've mentioned him and the new era quite a bit, but there are, I think, three or four concepts that might be useful, and I'll try to cover them as quickly as possible. The first is something that I take a lot of value from, probably more so than others, but he has a concept called the two integrations. And what this holds is that Chinese Marxism from the beginning was always already an integration with Chinese culture, Chinese values, and um, and um, and so we see Mao, Li Dajiao, and others having their own um, Chinese cultural orientation when they're understanding Marxist dialectics, or might say reimagining it in a Chinese context. But he also says that China is continuing to go back to the deep well of Chinese wisdom, to bring forth ideas that can further enrich Chinese Marxism, as well as still learning from Western Marxism or classical Marxism or Soviet Marxism. So there's still this integration. There's the original integration, but then also the second integration. In the second integration, we see a number of major innovations. Maybe my favorite, it relates to green development and concerns for climate change. By some estimates, China is the most vulnerable country in the world when it comes to climate change in terms of numbers of people and amounts of fixed capital investments that are exposed. In fact, China risks being hollowed out from the northwest all the way down to Beijing with desertification. But in the coastal regions, Shandong, Shanghai, Jiangsu, and the Greater Bay Area, Hong Kong, Guangdong, Guangzhou, these areas, Macau, um, that these are three of the top five most vulnerable areas in the world due to extreme weather and other problems associated with climate change. At the same time, we know that the global south disproportionately relative to the global north is vulnerable to climate change. And we know that China has become the world innovator in green innovation, the world leader in green innovation and green development, green transformations, so forth and so on. And this, there are different reasons for this, but one of the big reasons is the need to create solutions that will allow China to survive climate change. And if you understand a lot of the major development projects that are now happening in China, they're about trying to create green zones or safe zones against the dark wages of climate change. So these are all things that China is. No, I think very few people in the world really understand how far down that path China is. And so this is one of the reasons why personally in the center I direct, the Center for Ecological Civilization, we're trying to foster sort of global solidarity around the issue of cooperating on green development and green transformations. But one of the things that President Xi did was he went back to Lao Tzu and the first principle of Taoism, which is creating harmony between people and nature. And he brought that directly into Chinese Marxism as a core value to sort of link this historical value, this historical wisdom with contemporary needs. So this is just one example of the two integrations and the fundamental commitment to a multipolar, ecological civilization, both nationally but also globally. Of course, we see China now being the major propagator of green tech and green products around the world. through Belt Road, but also through sales of products that no one else is really able to produce at competitive price points. Now, the other thing is, clearly the commitment to a multipolar world as well as multilateralism. In my own language, I have somewhat controversially, but I think fairly, described this as new internationalism. So not the old internationalism of the Soviet Union, and not even sort of the some of the Chinese internationalism that was taking place after the PRC was formed and before the Cultural Revolution, which was kind of competing in a way with Soviet internationalism, even though the Internationale was already long defunct. I think that there is sort of a broad effort to create a new internationalism through the concepts of multilateralism and new multilateral organizations like BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and others that China is fostering, including trying to bring substantial reforms to the United Nations and other key international organizations, while at the same time resisting attempts by the United States to diminish or simply abandon these organizations in ways that threaten the entire world. So, when we look at the way Xi Jinping has advanced, this idea of a shared future for humanity, and the willingness to work with any country, whatever their ideological character, this rubric of reserving differences and emphasizing common ground, respecting the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. This is a very different model. So whereas the Soviet Union tried to lead from the front, China is trying to lead from the center, and at the same time not create a new system based on military alliances, but based on a true democratic structure in international affairs. So I call this new internationalism. Beijing doesn't like that term because it brings immediately to mind the old internationalism, which then plays directly into Western critics who see the Chinese today as being at the center of a new global communist plot. But nevertheless, I like the term new internationalism, and I'm going to stick with it for now.
Że miłeś bawi, mokrą dla rzęsi,